And now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dale Jamieson, who's written a very powerful book, Reason in a Dark Time. Mr. Jamieson.
Thank you very much. Well, first I just want to say what an honor it is to be here. This is such a powerful play, and there's so much going on in it. And I think in a way the last thing you need is to have someone just hurling words at you in a John-like way, confusing the character with Jim Henson, of course, in a John-like way. So what I want to do is just put about 4 things out there to think about that are sort of provoked by the play, or I think are in the play, and then just hear some of your reactions and what you may have to say. The first thing is this. Climate change is really the most difficult problem that humanity has ever faced. There are paid liars, there are feckless politicians, there are greedy consumers. But even if there weren't, this would still be an unbelievably difficult issue for us to get our arms around. Evolution constructed us to respond to sudden, threatening movements on the part of middle-sized objects. Evolution did not build us to respond to the buildup in the atmosphere of invisible, tasteless, smellless trace gases. We tend to think in categorical terms. We don't tend to think in probabilistic terms. We respond very strongly to events that happen proximately. We don't respond to events that happen that are very, very far removed in time and space from where we are. So all of those things make it really difficult for us to deal with this problem, even if there weren't the Franks in the world. Imagine, for example, if carbon dioxide were a sickly green color that stank to high heaven. We'd be dealing with a very, very different kind of problem than the one that we now face. So that's the first thing I just want to put out there, that yes, there are bad actors. Yes, there are complacent actors, probably most of us, but it's still a damned difficult problem. The second thing I want to say, which I think the play does an excellent job of bringing out, is the relationship between science and policy is extremely complex. John often seems to have a rather naive idea that all I have to do is do my science, tell the world about it, and everyone's going to go, right, right, I'm going to change my behavior. That's the way it is. Science tells us what we ought to do. Science doesn't tell us what we ought to do. Science tells us how the world is. And science tells us how the world will be, probabilistically, on certain pathways. But science doesn't give us the oughts. It doesn't tell us what we ought to do. It doesn't tell us how we ought to live. And it doesn't tell us what kind of world we ought to be leaving our children and our grandchildren. There's always that gap between what the science can do and what we have to do. And I think the play does an excellent job of showing how much space there is in that gap. And that is one of the key problems with climate change, that science is at its most authoritative when it is describing the world. When the scientist moves away from the laboratory and starts telling us how to live, they're now in the world of politicians, of priests, of bartenders, and your mother. They're just another person telling us what we ought to do. The third point I want to bring out, which I think is also really excellent in this play and quite unusual, I think, when artists try to confront issues like climate change. You know, when you think about climate change, often the focus is just on this world we're making, you know, how catastrophic it is and all of that. All of that's true. But what we often tend to lose sight of is that life is really built up out of moments and encounters with other people, with other creatures, with nature, with cities, with places we love and places we hate. And in some ways, the fundamental challenge of climate change, you know, isn't to save the polar ice caps or to save the polar bear. Those are important challenges. But the fundamental challenge is to how to find meaning in a world that is undergoing this rapid change. And so I very much like the character of Uncle, for example, because in a way, Uncle would be Uncle and living his life whether climate change was happening or not. Uncle is somebody who is all about forging meaning in the life that he's living in the world. And yes, this is a climate change world, but it's not just a climate change world. It's a world that he feels connected to in the past, connected to in the future. And that's a fundamental challenge that we all face. Climate change exacerbates it by cutting us off from the past and from the future. But we're all going to have to somehow figure out what love means, what beauty means in a world that is undergoing this change. And the last point I want to make before just turning this over to you is really a more political point. We've had this negotiation that's been going on now since 1992. And essentially what's happened is diplomats have flown around the world, scientists have released reports. Every 4 or 5 years we hear that it's the last time to save the planet. But if you actually just look at the data, essentially there's an inverse relationship between how much people talk about climate change and how much the concentrations of greenhouse gases increase in the atmosphere. What that means is that we've already committed the planet to climate change, to a very serious climate change, of which we're just in the earliest stages. Another lesson, I think, is that there aren't any adults anymore. Or at least, if there are adults, they're not really behaving in a very adult way. They're not going to solve this problem. The only thing that is going to solve this problem is really citizen activism. And one of the things we've been terribly lacking in the climate movement is this, is essentially the forms of cultural expression that actually move an issue from just something that most people maybe know about and think is bad, and the polls show that. I mean, despite all the denial stuff, most people believe in climate change, they know it's a problem. It's just not a very visceral problem. It's not a high priority problem. And part of why it's not a high priority problem, as opposed to other very, very serious problems like racism and sexism and homophobia and so on, is that it doesn't connect to people's personal experience. They don't see it played out in the world and in their lives in a way that's vivid and in a way that makes connection with them. And so if this climate justice movement is really going to get traction, to slow down the rate of change, to help us adapt to climate change, to do this in the most just and humane way possible, it's going to have to broaden out from among scientists and philosophers and, you know, all of us who've been talking about these issues for years, and it's going to have to become an issue that appears in literature, in the culture. I guess Seinfeld's not on anymore, but it's going to have to just permeate every dimension, because that's what's going to make the issue come up from something people know about, but they don't feel. You know, it's like the difference between knowing that the stove is hot and putting your hand on the burner. And it's this cultural stuff that can do that in an imaginative way and bring people into reality with the world that we're going to face. So thank you very much for taking that step.